When it comes to an art fair booth setup, there are lots of things to consider. I mean, there are really cheap booths, there are really expensive ones, and a whole lot in between. Now, I've been doing this for the last 10 years, selling my art at art fairs all around the Midwest. I make a full-time living from this, so I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned, so that way you'll be able to figure out when is a good time to save on your art fair booth and when it's a good time to splurge. And first off, I think the best tip is that if you're just starting out, you want to go cheap. This is because you want to figure out proof of concept. And what I mean by this is you need to be able to get your artwork to a few smaller art fairs, like maybe local shows where your booth fees are $100 or less if you can find them. So that way you can see if your artwork is going to sell. And also you can see if you like doing art fairs, because there are a lot of really bad things about art fairs that sometimes people, when they start doing them, they don't realize, like you're out in the elements. So if it's raining, you're having to deal with rain, getting on your tent, on your stuff. You're having to work for sometimes 12-hour shifts every day for 3 or 4 days in a row, and sometimes you won't even make minimum wage for doing it. This means that if you're not selling very much at the art fair, you're probably not going to be having that much fun, especially if the weather is bad. You really have to know this going in. Not every art fair is going to be fun, and not every art fair is going to lead to an amazing amount of profit. But I think it's a good idea to test market your work. Go into these shows, try it out, and see if you like it and see if you can sell. In this case, it's important to have a very cheap booth. So you want to get a pop-up tent, something that's still water resistant though, not the very cheapest pop-up tent you can get. Here's one of the pop-up tents that I've used in the past. Now, of course, I've upgraded since then to a much better tent, but just getting started, a pop-up tent will work great. You also need weight bags. For any tent that you have, weight bags are an absolute must. You do not want your tent to fly away in the wind. At these type of events, there are so many high wind conditions, and it's unexpected. The weather reports could say it's only 10 mile an hour, and then all of a sudden there are 20 mile an hour wind gusts and your tent's up flying across the art fair, landing maybe on somebody else's tent or even on a customer, and you do not want that. So if there's any message I can get across in this video, weight down your tent. You can buy weights, but you can also just use weights that you have at home. You can use anything. I've seen people use cement bags. They tie ropes around them and lay them behind their booth that they get somewhere like Lowe's, and then they just get them for the event and they leave them there, which is probably not the best thing to do. But I've seen people do it all, like cement blocks, cinder blocks, like stacks of them. Anything that you have that's heavy that you can tie your tent down with will work. The main thing is you want to have at least 20 pounds, but it's better to have 40 pounds of weight per leg on your tent. If you're a 2D artist, you're going to need a way to hang your artwork on the walls. There are lots of different options for this, but one thing if you're trying to do it on the cheap is to use a mesh tarp. I've linked them and everything else I discuss in this video in the description, but beyond that, in the description is my art fair supply list. It's absolutely free, and it gives you all of the different options, whether you're looking for a cheap booth or a more expensive booth. So I would definitely go get that. Honestly, there are a lot of other things you might need for your art booth, like a chair or a table or a checkout counter, but they are not absolutely essential. So I'm not gonna highlight them in this video. If you're trying to get a booth set up on the absolute cheap, the bare minimum you need is the tent, the weights, and a place to hang your work if you're a 2D artist, or tables if you are a 3D artist and you want to set your work on tables. Now, moving on to the more expensive options. Now, this is something that you want to do after you have proof of concept that your work is going to sell at these events and that you know you like doing them, and writing out the ups and downs of doing art fairs, because there are amazing successes, but there are also downsides to it, and you just have to have the grit to get through it. And if you have a bad show, you just got to step up and do the next one and hope it's going to work out better next time, and maybe have a better business strategy so that way it will work out better next time. But if you know that you're bought into this whole thing, you love art fairs, you're able to sell your work at them, now is the time to upgrade to a better booth, because the pop-up tents have inherent inherent disadvantages. First and foremost, they're not as weather resistant as the better tents like this Flourish trimline tent. I have used my Flourish trimline for years. I love this tent, and I will never go back to an Easy Up after this tent. Now, there are some downsides to the Flourish, like it's a little bit harder to set up than the pop-up tent, and all of the parts are kind of confusing. You got to make sure you bring everything with you, and if you miss a part and leave it at home, don't bring it to the show. You can't set up your tent in most cases. So you have to really be prepared and have everything that you need to take with you to put up these tents. But as long as you do, the tent is so much better. Now, it's a couple $1,000s, so it's a lot more expensive than a pop-up tent. But if there is any bad type of weather, like if there's a thunderstorm, you're not gonna have to worry about your artwork getting wet. It is so waterproof. I've had this thing in 60-mile-an-hour straight line winds at a thunderstorm where there was hail, all sorts of bad weather. I mean, it was so bad that we shouldn't have been in the tent, lightning, and nothing blew away. It was just fine. And I had it weighted down really good though. I had around 180, maybe 200 pounds of weight on it, on top of the work I had hanging in there and the weight of the tent itself. So it was very weighted down during that situation, but it never collapsed, it never leaked, and I've used the same tent for about 8 years now, doing 10 to 15 shows a year. It's never worn out. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that these tents are built to last, and they're so very good. So it's worth upgrading if you know you're going to be doing this full time and you have the money to invest in it because you've been making the money doing art fairs for the last year or two in your career. Next is sidewalls. There are two really good options for this if you're trying to upgrade from either grid wall or the mesh tarps. I didn't mention grid wall before because I honestly don't think it's a very good solution. It is cheap, but it's so heavy and bulky that the mesh tarps are a better solution if you're trying to find an ultra cheap way to hang your work. But if you do have these and you're thinking about upgrading, you basically have two choices. You have mesh panel walls. These are also from Flourish. They're the same company that makes the trimline tent that I just talked about. You also have the option of using pro panels. These are very high end. Now, I would like to say though, if you're trying to decide between the two of these, I have both and I've used both at indoor and outdoor events. But here's the thing, if you don't have a big van, you're probably not going to be able to carry the pro panels for an entire booth, your art fair tent, like this Flourish trimline, and everything that you need to carry. For example, if you're using a minivan like I am, I can't carry it all in the same minivan. I would need to have a big cargo van to carry everything. So for me and my needs, what I do most of the time for my outdoor shows is use the mesh panel walls with my Flourish tent because they all roll up very compact and I can fit it all in my minivan. And then I use the pro panels for my indoor shows because I don't need to carry the tent and everything else like the weight bags that come along with the tent. So that gives me a little bit more room in my minivan. But if I were a person who had a cargo van or had a trailer that I was pulling behind my van that I could carry everything in, then I would exclusively use the pro panels with my Flourish trimline tent. And here's why. Because the pro panels and the Flourish trimline look super high end. When you walk through an art fair and you see booths that are set up this way, you know that the artwork is worth money, that these artists have an amazing setup, that they've been doing this for a while, and they look very professional. So from a first glance, when a customer walks by, they know that work is high-end and you can sell it for more money if the customer feels like the work is high-end, right? And so all of these factors go into trying to figure out your business plan. And if you're trying to sell your work for more money, then having the pro panels and everything looks super professional in your booth is really important. Another thing to consider is that there are a portion of fine art fairs, like the higher level ones, that will not even let you in unless you have pro panels in your booth. They also want you to have a Flourish trimline or other dome type tent, not a pop-up tent. And so if you're trying to get into those higher tier art fairs, the juried ones that really are hard to get into, you need to have the best setup to impress them in your booth shot. So this is just something to think about. And if you're trying to step up your art fair game and to get into those other shows, then upgrading your booth is probably the thing you need to do, especially if you've been trying to get in and you haven't been getting in. Another thing I want to highlight is the use of what's called a French wall. I do this all the time in my art booth. It is the small wall that I put on the very front of my booth. Sometimes I have a French wall on each side of my booth. They're just little 3-foot wide walls. But what is amazing about this is if you use these walls, you will end up selling more work. I can almost guarantee it, because people will get to have a closer experience with your work and any signage that you have on that little front wall right as they're walking by. So they don't even have to walk in your booth to see your work up close and personal. And this makes them get interested in the work, and then they come in. And I love having my price advertising signage right out there on that front wall. People can see it easily as they walk up to my booth, and it gets people to come in my booth. And they want to see my print bins and look through everything and buy my art. So that's the ultimate goal. So that's why I think French walls are really good. It's also important to note that you don't have to have a flourished trimline tent to have a French wall in your booth. Basically, all you need are the mesh panel walls, and you can use the mesh panel walls in a pop-up tent or a trimline tent. So if you're at an in-between stage where you want to upgrade your booth from the pop-up tent, but you don't necessarily have the $2,000 to pay for the flourished trimline tent, you might just want to try upgrading to the flourished mesh panel walls from whatever cheaper wall that you were using prior, and then adding that French wall to your booth, because it will step up your game. It'll make your booth stand out from other people's art booths, and it's going to give you that extra display space right in front of the people as they're thinking about walking into your booth. Next, if you want to learn more art fair tips, check out this video. All right, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.